jealous for me. Love's like a hurricane. I am a tree bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. When all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory, gotta realize just how beautiful you are and how great your perfections are for me. And oh, how he loves us so. And oh, how he loves us, how he loves us so. And oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us, how he loves us so. Yeah, he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. Yeah, he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. Oh, we are his portion and he is our prize, drawn to redemption by the grace in his eyes. If grace is an ocean, we're all sinking. So heaven meets earth like an unforeseen kiss, and my heart turns violently inside of my chest. I don't have time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way oh he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh,
My name is Pastor Dave. Thank you for joining us. This is week 2 of our Crushing Fear series. This is a look at Joshua chapter 1 and how do we crush fear, right? We are in a world that there's a lot of fear being peddled all around us. It is easy to fall into it. It is on social media, the news, everywhere you look, it seems like there is something to be afraid of. And so how do we crush fear? How do we do as God told us and be strong and courageous? See, I think sometimes our temporal lobes need a massage, right? I've never paid for a massage. I don't know. To me, it just seems weird. Maybe you've gone to a masseuse and had a massage. It seems strange. It's not that I don't enjoy a back massage. I don't know if I would enjoy paying for one. Sometimes I've sat in those fancy massage chairs, and those can be entertaining for a moment. But sometimes our temporal lobes need a massage. Now, I'm not a brain surgeon. I'm assuming you aren't either. If you are, you can critique all of this and you can tell me where I'm wrong. But from my understanding, our temporal lobes, they are the parts of our brain where memory happens. And not just memory, but that is one of the things that happens there. Memory and emotions and a variety of other things. Again, I'm not a brain expert. I have a brain, you may debate that, but sometimes our temporal lobes need a bit of a massage and we need to remember some stuff, right? So, see, in our brain we have these neural pathways and they're comprised of neurons connected by dendrites. I've always wanted to say dendrite in a sermon, so I can check that off my bucket list. And so these pathways are created in our brains based on our habits and behaviors. As we participate in new activities, we are training our brains to create new neural pathways. And the pathways get stronger with repetition until the behavior becomes a new normal. See, what we can accomplish with our brains is pretty crazy. We can train ourselves to think and feel and act, and even emotional responses are largely trained. And it's based on these neural pathways that we create through repetition, learning, experiencing, reminding ourselves. And so when I say our temporal lobes need a massage, what I'm saying is that there are times when we have to remind ourselves. There are times when we have to purposefully go and do and experience things so that we can create the pathways in our brain that will help us instead of hurt us. See, if we watch too much of the negative news content constantly telling us to fear, it's creating pathways in our brain. And the more we intake and the more we drive those pathways, so to say, those become the default. They become the normal. And so we do need to be careful and we do need to make wise choices because we are training our brains to think a certain way. See, when we forget to remember, our courage fails. See, we can choose to remind ourselves of things that bring courage in faith, or we can sort of passively be a part of culture that is telling us to be afraid. And the results we get will be neural pathways that create a normal for us. In Joshua 1:3-5, it says this: I promise you, and just to set the context, if you remember, Joshua was the assistant to Moses. Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into what we call the wilderness. It was this desert between Egypt and what was to be the promised land. You go back to Abraham, and God had promised Abraham that he would become a great nation, and through him and through this nation that he would be a blessing to the whole earth. And of course, we have the culmination of that, and not the end of it, but the kind of the high water mark of that blessing is that Jesus comes from the lineage, from the line of Abraham. And then as Christians, we are called to continue to be that blessing. And so we have Abraham receives this promise of this land that will be the spot where the nation born of him will reside. But there is this history in between the fulfillment and the promise given. And that history is hundreds of years, and many of those were spent as slaves in Egypt. And then Moses comes along, and through Moses, God delivers the Israelites out of slavery, and they're to go from the land of slavery into the land of promise. And the journey between there wasn't 40 years as far as geography is concerned, but it was 40 years because they failed to have courage to believe God's promises. They failed to have the courage it took to do what was required of them to take this new land. And so they wandered in the desert for 40 years. When they didn't exercise faith and they gave into fear, God said, "You guys will die in the desert, and it will be your children who will take the promised land." And so during that time in the desert, Moses is leading them, and they get the Ten Commandments, and they have all these, quite frankly, some cool experiences with God. They also have some extreme moments of doubt and complaining and suffering the consequences of that. But along the way, Moses has this assistant, Joshua. And Joshua is now the leader. Moses died. They're on the edge of the promised land, and Joshua is now the leader. So Joshua 1, 3 through 5. "I promise you what I promised Moses. Wherever you set foot, you will be on land that I have given to you. From the Negev wilderness in the south to the Lebanon mountains in the north, from the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, including all of the land of the Hittites. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will not fail you or abandon you." So Joshua receives the extension of the promises given to Moses. What did God promise Moses? When we read these verses, and whenever you read Scripture, you've got to ask questions, right? So what did God promise Moses? Does Joshua, remember, Joshua has been in the wilderness, in the desert with Moses this whole time. So does Joshua remember the promises given to Moses? Does he remember how God began to fulfill those promises? Does he remember the things God has done for the people? He would have experienced it. He would have been witness to it. Does God keep his promises? Does Joshua remember the times when God said, "This will happen," and then God did that? Is God reliable? How was God with Moses? When God said, "I will be with you as I was with Moses," well, how was God with Moses? Does Joshua remember? And out of this comes these massive questions. Does God fail us? And does God abandon us? And that's a hard question. Those are hard questions to answer. And as I wrestle with those questions and those concepts, I think what it really comes down to is that No, God doesn't fail us. He doesn't. Are we disappointed with what God does? Absolutely, sometimes. Sometimes we wish God did things differently. See, what it comes down to is we confuse our plans for God's plans. And when we do that, we feel like God has failed us. We confuse our hopes for what God has intended. And when we do that, we feel like God has failed us. But he hasn't. He's maybe disappointed us, but God doesn't fail. Does God abandon us? No. Are there times when we don't feel or sense his presence? Well, sure. Are there times when he is silent? Yes. Are there times when there feels like there is this distance between us and God? Yes. Does God abandon us? No. He doesn't. And God says so. And God is reliable, and God is trustworthy. See, Isaiah 46:10 says, only I can tell, this is God speaking, only I can tell you the future before it even happens. See, God exists somewhere outside of time, and he knows the end from the beginning. I can tell you the future before it even happens. Everything I plan will come to pass. Not some things, not the important things, not the things that he really works hard on. He says, everything I plan will come to pass. For I do whatever I wish. So does God fail us? God doesn't fail his plans. God doesn't fail. There are times when our plans do not line up with God's plans, and in that sense, we are disappointed because God didn't do what we wanted. Did God fail? Not with what he planned. Did our plan match God's plans? Not always. Does God abandon us? No. John 14:18, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says, just in this part of this verse, he says, I will not abandon you as orphans. He doesn't abandon us. When we feel distant or lonely, or the silence is all we are focused on, has he abandoned us? No. So as God speaks these words in verses 3 through 5 to Joshua, Joshua has to begin to recount what did God promise Moses? What did God tell Moses? Because if I am now carrying on this mantle of leadership and God is telling me that what I promised Moses, I'm promising to you, what were those promises? And so Joshua, he was there. He experienced a lot of it. Not all of it, but he was around. So let's revisit. Let's go back to Exodus 5, 22 through 6:12. And it says this. Then Moses went back to the Lord and protested. Why have you brought all of this trouble on your own people, Lord? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh as your spokesman, he has been even more brutal to your people, and you have done nothing to rescue them. And Moses is upset because how he wants God to fulfill his promise is not how God is doing it there. And Moses is, quite frankly, mad about it. It's his plans not lining up with God's plans. And this is before they have been delivered from slavery in Egypt. This is as Moses is beginning that process. Moses is going to Pharaoh and saying, Pharaoh, let these people go. And Pharaoh is saying, no. And then increasing their labor. Kind of sending a signal like, Moses, quit interfering with the racket I have going here and leave me alone. But God had a plan, and God was going to deliver his people. Chapter 6, Exodus 6. Then the Lord told Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. When he feels the force of my strong hand, he will let my people go. In fact, he will force them to leave this land." And God said to Moses, "I am Yahweh the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, God Almighty." And I'll pause there for a minute. Our small group, we've been walking through this book and learning about the different names of God. And it's interesting to study how God describes himself and the names that God uses to describe himself and the background and what they mean and all that. And El Shaddai is one that it's used right here and in other places. And in Hebrew, it means the God that he is the all-sufficient one. He is more than enough. He is El Shaddai, all-sufficient, more than enough. I'll go to verse 4. "And I reaffirmed my covenant with them. Under its terms, I promised to give them the land of Canaan, where they were living as foreigners. You can be sure that I have heard the groans of the people of Israel, who are now slaves to the Egyptians, and I'm well aware of my covenant with them. Therefore say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will free you from your oppression and rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. I will claim you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from the oppression of Egypt. I will bring you into the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as your very own possession. I am the Lord." So Moses told the people of Israel what the Lord had said, but they refused to listen anymore. They had become too discouraged by the brutality of their slavery. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go back to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and tell him to let the people of Israel leave his country." "But Lord," Moses objected, "my own people won't listen to me anymore. How can I expect Pharaoh to listen? I'm such a clumsy speaker." But of course, if you know the story, Moses does go back to Pharaoh. And after some back and forth, Pharaoh does send the people away. He does release them. God does redeem them. God does deliver them. And now they have been delivered. They are now free from the yoke of slavery, and they are at the edge of the promised land, at the edge of the promise that God said, "I will give you this land." And God tells Joshua, everything I promised to Moses those 40-some years ago, I'm promising to you. So Joshua has to remember. Joshua has to remember what the promises of God are. For Joshua to have courage, for Joshua to crush fear, for Joshua to go into the promised land and face those enemies, he has to remember what the promises of God are. See, forgetting leads to fear. When we forget what God has done, we give in to fear. When we forget how God has forgiven us, when we forget how God has redeemed us, when we forget how God has worked in our lives, it leads to fear. See, courage is a battle against memory loss. The world is constantly trying to rewrite our neural pathways with messages of fear, with messages of discouragement, telling us that we can't, that we shouldn't, that we should be afraid, that it's all really bad. But to take courage, we must remember. Maybe you've seen those, I've seen it on t-shirts, the faith over fear. That slogan, I'm sure it appears in more than just t-shirts. That's just where I've seen it. Maybe you have one of those t-shirts. But it's not just a slogan, right? And it's not a bad. It's a good slogan, but it's more than a slogan. It should be more than a shirt, right? See, faith over fear it's cultivated, right? To live that out, it is a cultivated thing we do. We put work in, we put effort in. We have to massage our temporal lobes, right? We have to remember the promises of God. We have to remember the experiences of God that we have had. We have to remember the times when God has kept his promises, both to us and to people all through history, the people in Scripture. We have to remind ourselves. We have to read those stories. We have to talk about those stories with other people. We have to share our own story of how Jesus met us and saved us, of how Jesus forgave us, of how Jesus found us in our darkest times, and he pulled us out of that. We have to remember, we have to remind ourselves, because courage is a battle against memory loss. And our enemy, the devil, wants nothing more than to cause us to forget the promises of God so he can defeat us with fear. But I want to tell you, fear is a choice. Fear is not something that we just have to give into. Fear is not something that just happens to us. Fear is a choice. We can choose to listen to the promises of God. We can choose to engage with our faith. We can choose to step out in our faith. We can choose to surround ourselves with people who will encourage our faith. We can spend time reading about the promises of God. Or we can passively let those memories become distant. And what we're doing is choosing fear. We are choosing to set aside the promises of God and let fear fill that void. Fear is a choice. And we don't have to choose it. Faith is a choice. And we can choose it. We can choose to exercise our faith. We can choose to experience the promises of God by being active participants. Faith is a choice. When we choose faith, we are choosing to put our life into the hands, into the promises, into the commandments of God, and we are choosing to live in that. And it may cause us to do things differently than what the world would recommend or expect or want of us, but we are choosing to believe God and live how he has called us to live. And we begin to exercise our faith. We're going to have a Sabbath Sunday. And it's an exercise of faith. It's a day we set aside to rest in the promises of God. It's a day we set aside to spend time with family and reflect on the glory of God. It's a day where we purposely say, this doesn't all depend on me, and I rely on God to be my provision. Because you know what? He is, as he described himself, he is El Shaddai. He is more than sufficient. Whatever needs you have, God is more than enough. Whatever healing you need, he is all sufficient. Whatever obstacles are in your path, he is all sufficient. And to choose faith is to choose to rely on him, to be who he is, and allow his plans to be elevated above our plans, to live holy as he has instructed us. Faith is a choice. And we are making choices between faith and fear every single day. And some of them are small and some of them are major. Some of them may not feel like they are doing much, and some of them are having major implications in our life. But every day we're putting those choices on this house we're building, brick by brick by brick. Our life is made up of all of these little choices between faith and between fear. Are we going to take courage? Are we going to crush fear? Because courage is a choice. Right? When God came to Joshua and said, be courageous, God was telling him, make this choice. Make the choice of courage. Joshua chapter 1 is, and I encourage you, read the whole chapter. But it's this amazing chapter where God is essentially telling Joshua to crush fear. The reason that you are on the edge of the promised land right now is because the prior generation gave into fear, and so you had to spend 40 years of your life wandering the desert waiting for them to suffer the consequences of their actions. But now it is your turn to choose courage and to go in and take the promised land. It's your time, Joshua, to crush fear. It's your time to crush fear and follow God. How are you going to do it, Joshua? How are you going to crush fear? And in the verses we read, I think God is instructing Joshua on one of the ways he will crush fear is to remember the promises. Remember what I promised to Moses. Remember how I fulfilled some of those promises and how I will fulfill the rest of those promises in your life. See, to crush fear, we must remember the promises of God. For Joshua, he was at this point where Moses is dead. He is now the leader. The promises given to Moses are decades old, but Joshua was there. Joshua witnessed some of those. Joshua experienced some of those. Joshua needed to remember those promises and to trust, to choose faith over fear, and to walk in courage. See, faith and courage are not just concepts. They're things we actively choose and things we actively walk in. And when we do that, we will begin to more and more experience the promises of God being fulfilled in our life. Joshua 1:9. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. It's time to crush fear.